We started off 7-Eleven looking at the threads of history, if you don't remember those. Man has no inherent evil, man-centered truth, belief and dependence on science, belief in human progress, and how these themes relate to the First World War. And everyone's coming up with some great ideas. The idea of man-centered truth with the Armenian genocide, that the Turks have been able to convince themselves that what they did was not wrong, that it wasn't a genocide. In particular with technology and weapons and advancing those weapons, that mankind is relying more on science in order to become superior to their enemies. That humanity is progressing through this technology, which is one way of looking at it. But all of it really is showing the sort of the summative statement of these threads of history, that humanity, without faith and reliance on God, eventually creates destruction. We're studying that destruction. We're studying what happens when man relies too much on himself. Okay, so we're talking about total war. Okay, so we're talking about total war not relating to a video game, but having to do with new modern war that is entirely reliant on an entire society. If you think of wars in the past, the soldiers, the knights, would ride off on their horses. They would have purchased a sword, and then they would get it sharpened occasionally. But now, modern mechanized warfare causes sort of an industry, a business of war. You have to have a factory produce the boots that soldiers wear. You need a factory that makes the guns and bullets. Also, total war relies on the involvement of civilians, not just the soldiers. So even though the soldiers in the Army and the Navy, they're the ones fighting the war, that wars cannot be won without the support of the populace. So in this propaganda poster here, we're seeing this encouragement to get involved. You might not be a soldier. If you are, that's wonderful, but it's okay if you're not. There's still work for you to do. You can be a nurse. You can work in a munitions factory. You can work for the government. There are still things you can do. Another element of total warfare is the involvement of the government. And the first time we really see this is in the Shell crisis. Now, war was good for the economy. It was good for business because now all of these private companies, private businesses are manufacturing goods for war materiel. In Britain, the government was purchasing these supplies from different companies, in particular artillery shells, and they weren't working. Sometimes they would explode in the cannon. Sometimes they would be shot over to the enemy trench and would not explode. This was extremely damaging because how can soldiers do their job if their materials aren't functioning? So the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, and hopefully you remember that after the Battle of Somme, when the British were horrified at that huge loss of life, that they wanted the government to change their tactic. They didn't want to quit the war, but they wanted to be more effective, and as a result, David Lloyd George takes over as Prime Minister. So in the Shell crisis, he now gets the government involved. He starts to take over the armaments industry to make sure that the soldiers out on the front lines get the functioning materials they need. This is the government getting involved with civilian business, with the civilian population. Now, the English people, they like their freedoms. We look back to the Magna Carta when the nobles and knights didn't want the government, didn't want the king to have so much power. But in wartime, it is sometimes necessary to give up a few of those personal freedoms. The Shell crisis sort of starts off a trend of the government getting more and more involved in civilian life for the purpose of hopefully leading to a positive result for the war. The law that encompasses all of this is called DORA, Defense of the Realm Act. We had a similar law in America after the September 11th attack. It's called the Patriot Act. And under it, a number of things are made legal in this time of war. It is the job of the government to make sure that they win the war and that the people are made safe. That might require some personal liberties being taken away temporarily. Even though the British people don't like giving up those freedoms, they also appreciate that the government is demonstrating it is fully committed to winning this war. So in a way, it's a bit of a morale boost. A big part of DORA is controlling resources, making sure that the soldiers get what they need in order to win the war. So perhaps you at home might not have as much of any resource that you would wish. Also, DORA allows for martial law in the worst case scenario. Martial law is when the army has full control of the system. This would only happen, for instance, in the event of an invasion, that the army would take control, that the civilian government or that the more political aspects of government would be suspended in order to make sure that the outcome would be victorious. Under DORA, there are more and more laws passed. One of them has to do with just supplies, that different industries will have to be giving up control temporarily to make sure that the country wins the war. Conscription is part of Defense of the Realm Act. Conscription you might be more familiar with as a draft. That 2 years in, I mean, it's 1916. The war's been going on for 2 years. Young men aren't really volunteering frequently. We talked about at the beginning of the war, they were very excited. They were thrilled to sign up for a new adventure. But 2 years on, a lot of those men haven't come home or they've been injured, so other people aren't signing up. A conscription means that the government can force young men to join the army. Now, they would rather have volunteers. They would rather that young men enlist on their own. But if necessary, in order to win the war, the government will force people to join the army if they have to. And I love this propaganda. They're using an emotion. They're trying to elicit an emotional response, trying to almost guilt men into volunteering. Then there's rationing. More and more, not just industries, but now average citizens will have their supplies controlled. Often it has to do with food, and whenever there is rationing of food, there is a black market, and they try and convince people don't hoard food, don't hide it and try and sell it for a better price. That would be unpatriotic. I love this one. Sometimes rationing is about fabrics or supplies or rationing labor. In this case, it's saying don't buy fancy new clothes when those workers should be producing parachutes or uniforms or boots for the soldiers. So don't be selfish. Maybe it has to convince you that you should create a vegetable garden. Don't go to the shop and buy more food that we could be sending over to the soldiers. Make your own. Another element of total war is censorship, controlling the information that gets to the general public. Over here you see a couple images of letters written by soldiers home, and the one on the top has been released by the censor. Everything in it is okay. The government, the military was reading all these letters that the men were sending home. Down at the bottom there is a telegraph, and parts of it have been, it's called redacted. Parts have been removed by the censor because there's a couple of reasons they could do this. The government doesn't want certain information getting to the general public yet, or perhaps the soldier was writing about a location he was in that is sensitive information, or the fear that this information could get into the wrong hands. So that is limiting the amount of information that gets out there. Then propaganda would be changing or adapting the information to get the result you want. This is what your homework was about, and these 4 styles. We've got recruiting, sometimes using guilt, are you absent? Sometimes trying to use friendship and, hey, all your buds are over in France, you should be over there too. Here we have definitely using the guilt factor. Dad, what did you do in the Great War? And trying to convince men, don't be a coward. Don't have to tell your children you didn't do anything. Sign up today. Then we have dehumanizing the enemy, as we are seeing in All Quiet on the Western Front, when Paul is realizing that the Russians are just like him. They're technically his enemy, but only because of a piece of paper that the government signed. The army, the military, the country does not want soldiers feeling that way, does not want civilians feeling that way. Otherwise, they wouldn't support the war. So you have to convince yourself that your enemy is so beyond evil. We have examples of sort of British and French propaganda that the German has blood on his hands and is out to destroy the innocent young women of the world. But then on the top right, you have a German version that the British are out to control everything, that they are spinning their evil web. Sometimes very sensational tactics used, referencing the Lusitania sinking, referencing referencing events that would try and inspire people to join. And one of my favorites, the idea of these rumors that were so horrible. Here's some French propaganda showing a German soldier killing a little baby. Now, this never happened, but there were plenty of rumors and propaganda um, describing the Germans as vicious baby killers. That is how you convince a country to keep fighting. In Germany, the same thing happened. There were rumors that the British and French were poisoning the wells of German civilians. Didn't happen. But it is the idea of continuing this hatred of your enemy. Then there's the home front. Not everyone's going to be in the army. Some people are going to have to stay home. So what can they do? They can encourage their loved ones to join the army. They can knit socks. They can buy war bonds, which means you pay cash right now, and the government gives you a certificate that says they will pay you back in 20, 30 years with interest. Because the government needs money now. Maybe it has to do with baking your own bread, making your own jam, growing your own garden, because you don't want to take supplies that could be given to the soldiers in the front lines. Definitely, again, we're seeing that guilt factor, using guilt to get the response that they want. And then there's general encouragement. This is just to remind them, hey, we're not in this alone. We have allies. Keep going. We're going to be victorious. That's it for 7-11.